Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Astro Consciousness channel. I'm Millie, and I am here to give you your forecast for Jupiter transiting the sign of Gemini from May 25th, 2024 to June 9th, 2025. So let's talk about a little bit of basics before I move into what Jupiter and Gemini has the potential to bring us over the next year. One of the first things we want to remember is that it takes Jupiter 12 years to transit the entire zodiac. So, what that means is that Jupiter spends about a year, more or less, give or take a few weeks, sometimes a month or two, in each sign, and therefore it comes back to the sign that it was 12 years prior. What does this mean for us? What this means for us is that we can take some of the experiences and life lessons from previous Jupiter cycles, depending on the sign that we're looking at, and depending on how old you are, so that we can gauge and get a sense of what the upcoming cycle is going to be about. Think back to the years of 2012 and 2013 and begin to ask yourself, what happened to me in that time that shifted the perception that I have of myself, therefore gave me a greater perspective of my place in the world itself, and of the people in it? How did experiences in my life at the time perhaps change my mind about a lot of things that I've felt very certain about? So Gemini has a lot to do with new information coming in. And in Jupiter, how did we grow from the new information, from the new experiences that came into our lives? Okay. So that's a really great place to start, because as we move through this Jupiter and Gemini from 2024 to 2025, chances are that the same thing is going to take place. There is a changing of the mind that is going to happen because we receive new information and experience new things in our lives that are going to ask us to do that. And again, as I move along the video, I'll explain why. Another thing that we want to keep in mind is that Jupiter is known as the benefic of the zodiac. So what does that mean? Jupiter is known as the planet of optimism, growth, abundance, wealth, luck, and a lot of these things that we tend to really fall in love with. Give me more, come and fix all my problems. The thing with Jupiter is that it doesn't really work that way unless where we're meeting it is that. And I think that a lot of Jupiter's abundance and growth and luck and wealth and abundance and optimism has so much to do with how we define those terms. Okay? Because Jupiter in itself is a planet that serves as a magnifying glass. It is this energy that hovers over that part of our life, that part of our chart, and says, look at what's happening here. There is an element of undeniable, inescapable awareness that Jupiter brings to whatever part of our life and our chart that it touches. And so in this case, it is based on what Jupiter is going to put a magnifying glass on, right? Based on what it's going to expand and grow. And you being unable to look another way, to not have awareness of it. How does that change your mind about how you want to continue approaching that part of your life, that part of yourself, relationships, or anything that Jupiter and Gemini is going to mean and manifest for you? Gemini in the zodiac is the sign that gifts us with the reminder of there is always another way to look at something. There is always a different perspective. There is always more information. And how lucky are we that we get to have different points of views that are fascinating to us? That is Gemini's gift in the zodiac to us, amongst a lot of other things. But these are a few of the things that come with this transit because, again, if you think back to 2012 and 2013, based on new information that you received or based on an experience that you had that is very memorable, How did that change the way that you look at life? And being that Gemini is the first air sign of the zodiac, it is the first sign that represents thought, that represents I think, I perceive, right? There is something really unique about the experience of discovering something new, discovering a new thought, discovering a new way of looking at something. So, one of the things you want to keep in mind in the zodiac is that as the signs progress, they evolve and they mature. That doesn't mean that the second half of the zodiac is air quotes better than the first half of the zodiac, not at all, but there is an evolution that takes place. And Gemini being the first sign of the zodiac, I'm not saying that it isn't evolved. It's evolved in its own right, but what I mean is that it gives us with the understanding of a seed thought, of a brand new thought, of a brand new perspective. And considering that Gemini rules Mercury, and Mercury represents so much of the way that we perceive ourselves, that we see ourselves, and therefore how we communicate to the world, how we see the world, how we see others. Again, what we have to communicate, what we want to share, how we see ourselves, how we see others, how we see the world is going to embark on an interesting shift. Okay. And the reason for that is that Jupiter in Gemini is clearly not going to work by itself. Throughout its entire transit is going to have two major connections with other planets. I'm going to talk about that. But this is what's really setting the tone for a transformation that needs to take place in the way that we see the world and the place that we feel we have in the world. So, with that said, let's get started. So, what I've done is that I'm going to give you 5 bullet points that are going to serve as umbrella themes, if you will, so that you can keep those in mind through the trajectory of Jupiter and Gemini. And again, if you see me look to the side is because I'm reading my notes. So one of the first things that you want to keep in mind with Jupiter and Gemini is that this energy invites us to remember the endless fascination that we have with life. So remember, as I mentioned earlier, Jupiter is the first sign, the first air sign of the zodiac that says, oh, there's a thought. I perceive something. And so when we perceive something, especially for the first time, for those of you who have been around babies or those of you who have your own children, you can understand the fascination of a child's eyes in discovering something new, right? In the way that they touch your face, in the way that they touch your clothes, they're feeling textures, they're feeling how your skin feels, right? They're tasting something for the first time, they're seeing things for the first time. And so Jupiter in Gemini is inviting us to have a similar interaction with life. One of the reasons that it's important for us to have this reintroduction to life, if you will, this willingness to shift our perspective about what life is because Jupiter in itself is the planet that represents the understanding of how life works so that we can actually have an accurate assessment of life. So we need to experience life. And Gemini invites us to have a beginner's mind and invites us to have an open mind in order to experience something new and something different. Okay, again, what does this look like in our lives? Someone has been in a career for a really long time, and what they've decided to do is that they're going to do it in a different way. They're probably going to become a consultant of the thing that they have been doing for a long time. So you're having a beginner's mind in that you've never been a consultant. But Jupiter there reminds you of the life experience that you have had in this career, that there's a lot of knowledge that you do carry, but that not only do you have to keep a beginner's mind in terms of what it means to work for yourself and be a consultant, but that you also have to share and disseminate the information as a consultant to potential clients in a very intro-friendly way. So we cannot underestimate the willingness to meet people where they are. This becomes really important because remember, Jupiter and Gemini isn't just happening to me. It's not just happening to you. It's happening to everyone. So at large, this is going to look like, oh, people are being introduced to a lot of new things. People's attention span is probably going to become a lot shorter because of the amount of information that is going to be proliferated and shared and disseminated out into, into the world even more. Um, and I think that's really important to understand because if you're someone, for instance, who works for yourself, it's not so much about just grabbing the attention of everyone, but it's much more about connecting with someone who already, in a way, speaks your language. And this calls for the willingness to have much more genuine connections, right? Now, that doesn't necessarily have to do with Jupiter or Gemini, but it is going to be something that is going to ground the way that we communicate certain things in our life and to other people. Let's say that this has to do with a personal relationship. Because of other aspects that Jupiter and Gemini is going to have, this is going to make much more sense a little later on, but I'm going to bring it in here today. Let's say that you are someone who has had a traditional looking relationship for a few years or quite some time, right? And what that means is that you both, you live in the same place, your days kind of look the same day in and day out. Jupiter and Gemini, along with other things happening in the sky, is going to say, well, what if we did this relationship differently? It doesn't mean that the relationship has to come to an end, but it does mean that in some way, shape, or form, a new opportunity or a new world is being opened for one of you or both of you. And what if you kept a beginner's mind at this stage in the relationship and saying, what if we tried to have a relationship in a different way? So what does this mean? You don't live together, right? You don't live together. You go from living together, but maybe there's an opportunity that someone gets that someone gets somewhere else and says, okay, then we're going to have a long distance relationship. What if someone says, I want my own space, right? That's a different thing. That's a different manifestation that has nothing to do with an opportunity coming your way, but it has everything to do with changing your mind and a shift in perspective about your place in the world, your place in the relationship. So here's where it gets interesting, right? Because for some people, that might not be great news. It's like, what do you mean you don't want to live with me? But what we have to keep in mind is that Jupiter here expands our desires. It expands our need to have a specific relationship to life in order to feed the soul, in order to be able to have a different perspective of what we are capable of. And this is where things get really interesting because when you think about a shift in the way that you see something, on the one hand, it's great. Yeah, I want to see myself differently. I want to believe myself possible. But what are the things that genuinely and fundamentally have to change within you and in your life in order to make that happen? The second point I wanted to bring is that Jupiter and Gemini is really going to emphasize this need for endless learning. Okay. So Jupiter and Gemini is a great opportunity for anyone who wants to learn something new. But here's the thing. This doesn't have to look like traditional academia, especially not in Gemini. This is about not necessarily going against the grain, not because of Jupiter and Gemini in itself, but because we're saying, what if we learned a different way? So this is great for anyone, yes, who wants to go back to school, who wants to get a master's, PhD type of thing. You can absolutely do that. but this is especially going to be fruitful for those who want to do shorter term things, right? Who want to do coaching certifications, who want to do certifications in something that adds to the knowledge that they already have. This is also going to be great for anyone who is a facilitator or a teacher in any way. If you teach astrology, if you teach tarot, if you teach human design, whatever it is, it's a really beautiful time to begin pushing those things forward because there is an openness. There is an overall openness about people wanting to see things in a different way. And this yearning for learning is going to be very much palpable in the air. Now, what you're going to want to keep in mind here is that this isn't so much about changing people's minds as much as it is about presenting a different point of view that then the person receiving the information gets to choose whether or not they change their mind about something. This may seem obvious, but here's where I'm getting at with this. Because when we're talking from a collective perspective, a lot of the things that we are going to be fed, particularly when we're talking about like media type of things that we're collectively fed, that we're collectively taught, we have to really become very discerning and aware of the attempt of what we're being fed, the attempt of how someone or something greater than us is trying to change our minds about something. And so in that endless learning, instead of just going in this hypnotic cycle of more consumption, more information, I want to know more, I want to know more of the things, we have to be discerning enough to say, what am I actually looking at? What information am I actually ingesting? And what is it actually doing to the way that I see the world? Because it's very easy, again, with Jupiter, it's the planet of expansion. More is more. Gemini, here's more information. Here's more information. Here's a different perspective. All of that can be very exciting. And I think that to an extent it is. But when we're talking about it from a different perspective, from the things that we very naturally consume as we scroll through our phones, for instance, what are we consuming? And there is this sense of endlessness. There is a sense of overstimulation. When you think about how much you're being told something, how much you're being shown something, how much you're being told to believe a certain perspective, you have to be able to take a step back and ask yourself, does this resonate with me? Is this true for me? Okay. Now, point number 3 is do not underestimate the fact that you have something important to say. So, on the one hand, this is an invitation for all of us, to be much more open with our communication, with what we think, with what we feel. Because as we move more and more into the Jupiter and Gemini energy, we're being invited to that because if there's an invitation to learn something new, to change our minds, the way that we can do that is to have contrasting views. Because of the way that, social media is set up, for instance, or certain platforms are set up, there is an algorithm that tends to feed us things that pretty much only align with the things that we like, right? So what that does over time is that it creates a certain narrative. What that does over time is that it creates a very narrow outlook on the world that is simply just your own. I'll give you an example. I think that a lot of times I take for granted or I forget how much in my own little astrological world I am. And because of the things that I see online and the friends that I have and the communities that I'm a part of, it's very easy for me to forget that not everybody thinks that way. Not everybody, and it's not that I expect everyone to see everything through an astrological lens, but there can be this assumption of everyone knows their sun, moon, ascendant, for instance, right? Because again, my algorithm, the people that I'm around, the communities that I'm around, the people that I talk to day in and day out, clients, all of the things, they know these things. But there is a whole other world out there, right? And there have been times where I've had to remind myself of, wait a minute, the world is a lot bigger than this little world that I've created for myself. It's a very silly example, but it's something that I think is going to really save us in some way, shape, or form from expecting others to see life solely from our perspective. And while that may seem like a very obvious thing, like, of course, not everybody's going to agree with me. Of course, not everybody's going to see things in the way that I do always. The reason that Jupiter and Gemini invites us to have dialogue and it invites us to not underestimate the things that we have to share and talk about is because it's inviting, I think that it at large is inviting us to have conversations and perhaps even debates. Because I think that it is through that, through having conversations, perhaps difficult conversations or simply conversations that have contrasting views, that we can begin to close the gap that has been created over time in simply seeing life through a very, very narrow lens. Now, personally, this isn't something that I have really read in any astrology books or seen anywhere else, but when I look at where the collective is, and when I look at the way that the signs work and the gifts that they invite us to cultivate, I think that this is one of them. It may be a little over optimistic, I can understand that, but it's still an invitation. So when I speak what I think, when I speak, from what I know, what I feel passionate about, not everyone is going to receive it, but can we have a dialogue about it? Can we, in true Gemini fashion, keep an open mind, keep a beginner's mind? And so, there, in that space, the invitation of Jupiter and Gemini of not underestimating that you have something important to say in the world, not because it's more important than what anyone else has to say, but because it's equally important to share information from one perspective to another. And that's a different way of looking at Jupiter and Gemini, because when we think about the principle of Jupiter, it is growth, it is abundance. Growth and abundance can happen, and there can be a growth in the way that we communicate with each other simply by having conversations with contrasting points of views. Again, I think that perhaps because of the way that I see the world, I think that might be a very overly optimistic hope, but I mean, why not? Another point that I wanted to make is this is interesting because where I'm getting my notes from is the Book of Fire from Stephen Forrest. And one of the things that he mentions here is never underestimate your powers of persuasion. Okay. So, on the one hand, for anyone who sells anything, who shares anything, who wants to begin cultivating and creating a connection, a community, sell products, this is a really beautiful time. Jupiter and Gemini is an invitation to share, shameless self-promotion, okay? But here's the thing. This isn't about manipulating anyone to do anything that they don't want to do. This is about, when you really think about it, this is about connecting in such a genuine way where you're simply putting out there what you have to share with the world and understanding and trusting that those that are meant to work with you or gain something from what you have to share simply will connect with you, right? So the persuasive part doesn't necessarily come from a place of manipulation. It actually comes from a place of, look, I'm really excited to share this with you. Are you interested or not? And I think that there's something to say about that because Gemini energy at its core can have that element of detachment, can have that element of not taking it personally when when someone doesn't, right, when someone doesn't connect in the way that they had hoped for. Now, that's a generalization. I think I'm much more talking about the essence of the sign of Gemini than I am talking about any particular person or however you experience, the energy of Gemini in your chart. I'm talking about the essence of Gemini. The fact that it is an air sign, the fact that it already teaches us a healthy form of detachment, because if you have a way that you look at the world, and I'm allowed to have a way of looking at the world, it doesn't make either one of us wrong. It just means that there are different ways of looking at the world. And at its core, at its essence, that is what Gemini represents. So when it comes to sharing your work in the world, by all means, please take advantage of Jupiter and Gemini, because if there is an opening of learning, if there is an opening of the potential of us changing our minds and having a different perspective on something, it is an invitation for anyone who feels that they have something to share with the world to share it, because there is someone out there waiting to hear what you have to share. And there is absolutely, again, no convincing anyone of anything when you understand, if I build it, they will come. Now, it will be important to understand that Jupiter in Gemini is going to have connection to two major planets through its transit for a year. But the planet that it's going to have the longest connection with is going to be Saturn. Okay, so right when Jupiter moves into Gemini, May 25th, 0 degrees, Jupiter in Gemini, what it's going to do is that it's going to create a trine or a favorable aspect to Pluto in Aquarius. So what does this mean? We have Jupiter in Gemini, which I've explained a lot of the possibilities, right? There's an expansion when we have a beginner's mind, when we keep a flexible mind, when we're learning something new, when we're willing to change our minds about something, when we're sharing something. Okay. That favorable connection, that trine to Pluto and Aquarius, has a lot to do with the transformation Pluto that comes in the future, Aquarius, when we are willing to open ourselves up to all of the Jupiter and Gemini things. Jupiter and Pluto connections are very powerful. They're very potent, and anything having to do with Pluto almost always, not almost always, pretty much always represents a transformation. So to me, Pluto in Aquarius represents the new era that we're moving towards, that we're really in, but we're just in the beginning of. At this point, we really have not even scratched the surface of the potential of what Pluto in Aquarius represents. Pluto in Aquarius is going to look so vastly different that right now its connection to Jupiter and Gemini is saying, you need to keep a flexible mind. You need to keep an open mind. You need to keep a beginner's mind, because what Pluto in Aquarius is bringing, you may not know exactly what that looks like, but it does require a great amount of flexibility and willingness to say, oh, okay, so this is how things have changed. So I have to learn a new way of doing things, right? I have to learn I have to learn how to use these new phones that may come up. I have to learn, I'm going to have to keep an open mind about learning how to use the technology that is going to present itself, right? That's more of a collective level. Now, Pluto's connection to Jupiter in the zodiac can actually be quite powerful. And this is especially true if you are someone who is embarking on a new chapter in their lives at this moment in time, whether it's a new chapter in your career, in your relationships, in your self-work, anything that is new for you in your life at this time, which I think a lot of people are experiencing because we're coming out of the Jupiter-Uranus conjunction in April. This Pluto is saying, yes, you will change, you will transform, but you have to trust the process and you have to allow yourself to be new at something. You have to allow yourself to be new at this part of your life, right? So I have a friend who, just finished her training to become a therapist. And now she's going to become a therapist. She's going to start working as a therapist. She has to be open-minded enough to know that even though she has studied all the things for 2 or 3 years, she has practiced, she has been under supervision. Once she goes out on her own, there's still a learning curve. And that learning curve will eventually end. And she will finally find herself, 1 or 2 years down the line and saying, I feel really good about this. My point with this is that we have to allow ourselves to be new at something, especially if we're starting it, because even if we think we know what we're doing, Pluto in Aquarius tells us people are thinking differently, people are looking for for different things, people are not identifying with something specific. They don't want to be identified as something. So there is an openness. There truly is, fundamentally, as a society, there are so many things that are falling apart, that are coming undone because we are in the middle of such a significant transition that is going to redefine the society that we live in, what it looks like, how it works. So how can we not change in that way? So I think that for anyone who works as a facilitator, for instance, you're going to notice that you're going to begin attracting different kinds of clients. For anyone who, a lot of people are in traditional relationships. Maybe they're going to want to open their relationship. This isn't anything new. And the reason for that is that back in December of 2020, Jupiter and Saturn came together and they started a brand new cycle. And so this actually takes me into the Jupiter square to Saturn in Pisces. So back in 2020, Jupiter and Saturn came together. Okay, they came together at 0 degrees Aquarius. And they started what's called a brand new synodic cycle. Now, with Jupiter and Gemini and Saturn and Pisces, they are going to create the first square, the first 90-degree angle of that entire cycle that they have to go through. So what does this mean? Remember, Jupiter and Gemini, the willingness of keeping an open mind, keeping a beginner's mind, the willingness to allow yourself to be new at something, Jupiter, the growth that comes from that. And Saturn in Pisces is saying, how devoted are you to this new way of being? How devoted are you, Saturn? How committed are you to this new life, to this new way of being, that you're going to be willing to let something end or die, Pisces? Okay, so this is important. And I think that far more than Jupiter's connection to Pluto, I think the actual transformation is actually coming from the very prolonged square 90-degree angle between Jupiter and Saturn. So 2 months that you're going to want to really keep in mind are going to be August of 2024 and December of 2024. Because this is when Jupiter and Saturn mathematically are going to be at exact squares to one another. So what does this mean? Here we have Jupiter and Gemini inviting us to not just look at life in a different way, but in order for us to look at it in a different way, we probably have to do it in a different way. And the square to Saturn and Pisces is the tension that comes when we change the way that we do things. Because Saturn represents the tried and true. It represents the foundations that we have built thus far. It represents the things that we are committed to right now. And the tension that comes with a 90-degree angle is going to come from, I want to grow and expand in this way. And the Saturn energy can feel limiting. So this is going to manifest in one of few ways. I think on the one hand is if you're someone who's starting something new, you're trying to grow something new, you're trying to grow a practice, a business, a relationship, the squares between Jupiter and Saturn that are really going to last most of the Jupiter and Gemini transit, but you'll notice specifically there will be turning points in August of 2024 and December of 2024. You're going to say, oh, I thought this was going to be a lot easier. I thought that changing my mind about something was going to be a lot easier. I thought that learning something new and actually applying it was going to be easier. And it's not. Because the square to Saturn is Saturn will always represent the mastery of something. Jupiter wants to be overly optimistic and say, yeah, I know, but I know, I'll figure it out. I'll figure it out. I know. But the square to Saturn is about how much are you willing to master this? How much time, energy, and effort are you actually willing to put into this? And this doesn't mean that it's going to be super hard, but there is going to be an element of grounding you, of really bringing you down and saying, okay, this is probably going to require um, a little bit more effort, perhaps a different level of intention. It's going to really put a spotlight on the intention behind why you're doing what you're doing. And here's why. Because Saturn in Pisces has so much more to do with devotion than with obligation and commitment on its own. Okay, so let me give you a little bit of a contrast so that you understand what I mean. Between 2020 and early 2022, Saturn transited both of the signs that it rules, which is Capricorn and Aquarius. Okay, so what was our experience as a collective when Saturn transited Capricorn and Aquarius during those times? There were lockdowns. We were obligated to follow certain rules, certain limitations, certain boundaries that said, this is what you can and cannot do. These are the hours under which you can and cannot do them. And it was very, it was like this very authoritative parent. And so when Saturn in its purest expression can be that, and it was transiting both of the signs that it ruled, so we really got a taste of that. So what did that leave us with? One of the movements that I've noticed with Saturn and Pisces is people's understanding and willingness to say, if I don't really want to do something, I am not going to do it. If it's not a full-bodied yes, then it's a hell no. That is a phrase that has become really popular over time that I notice more and more, gaining more and more traction, if you will, with Saturn and Pisces. Why? Because Saturn and Pisces is much more about devotion. And devotion has so much more to do with us being willing to do the things that we need to do for the things that we love, for the things that feel aligned to the soul. That's what we want to commit to. So back to the square with Jupiter and Gemini and Saturn and Pisces is, okay, so you say you want to do your own thing, you want to have your own business, you want to have your own practice, you want to be your own consultant, you want to do whatever it is that you want to do. Okay. During those squares, there is going to be an invitation for you to meet some kind of challenge, perhaps even a limitation that's going to somewhat test how devoted you are to this thing that you say you want to do. And if you keep a beginner's mind, if you keep an open mind to doing things differently than the way that you thought they were going to be, how does that then propel you forward? But here's the thing, we cannot outrun Saturn. So Saturn in those squares, in those bits of limitations or slowness, is going to win. We will not be able to make things go faster than they're going to go. And I think that that's probably the way we're going to experience those squares. Saturn tends to really slow things down. And particularly in that first square in August, Saturn will be retrograde. And so Saturn retrograde, Saturn moves slowly anyway. But Saturn, it moves even slower when it's retrograde. And there's a reason for that. It is so that we can assess the foundations we're building for what we want to see come to fruition in the long run. Okay. I think that another thing that Jupiter in Gemini square Saturn in Pisces is going to invite us to do is, how does mind meet spirit? And this is really interesting because when we're talking about Gemini, we're talking about the human mind, cognitive thought, communication, emails, text messages, the fun facts about things, which is the beginner's mind. Very like 101 type of type of energy. We're learning something new. Okay, that's great. It's very much from this realm, from this plane, from the human mind. When we're talking about Jupiter energy by itself, and we're talking about Pisces energy, we're talking about a higher level of consciousness. We're talking about simply going into like the 4D, 5D place of our existence instead of just the 3D, right? Instead of just what we see before us, which is very Gemini in nature. The combination of these two energies in a square can bring about a bit of crises, a bit of like, do I really believe that I can get through this? Do I really believe in this? Is this worth my time, energy, and effort? And here's what I'll say to you. Look, if Jupiter and Gemini is inviting us to have a beginner's mind, if Jupiter and Gemini is inviting us to keep an open mind, I think that in this case, Jupiter and Pisces, which is currently being transited by Saturn, is saying, can you trust that which you don't yet see? Can you go through the growing pains of something and understand that you will come out the other side? And that, I think, is the transformation that gets to happen. Because when you can be patient enough, devoted enough, Saturn and Pisces, to something that you really want, that has the potential to change the way that you view yourself because of what you might be capable of doing in this life, that's transformation, right? So this very much reminds me of a quote by Marianne Williamson. She says, a miracle is a shift in perception from fear to love, from a belief in what is not real to faith in that which is. That shift in perception changes everything. So again, remember August and December, and I think that those are going to be the months that are going to call for this. They're going to call for you to remember that which is not real yet, and having faith that it can, and having faith in that which is. And so what is real for you in that moment? Your willingness to move forward, your willingness to say, this is my why. This is why I'm doing this. It's truly a fascinating, it's truly a fascinating transit to have between Jupiter and Saturn. It's not always the easiest. I personally have a Jupiter square Saturn natally, and one of the things that I've had to learn is a lot of the things that I tend to do take a little bit longer of time. And one of my biggest lessons in life has been to be patient with the manifestation of the things I want to see come to fruition. And so with that, there's a constant coming back to myself. With that, there's a constant coming back to, okay, this is my why. This is what I believe in. This is why. This is how much I love this, right? And along the way of really asking myself, do I really want to continue doing this? Do I really want to continue doing this in this way? Does it really make sense to do things in this way? So the gift in the potential slowing down of the Jupiter Saturn square is it gives you the opportunity to reassess, right? Let's say that this has to do with a relationship that you're moving through, an important relationship in your life. if someone or both of you are going in different directions, but you don't want the relationship to end, I think that's actually a good thing, because what it means is that you are expanding the definition of how a relationship needs to look, which is much more about Pluto and Aquarius. But with the understanding of, oh, even though we were both in agreement, this is still a little harder than I thought. Okay, but does that necessarily mean that the relationship has to end? For some people, it might, right? This is very dependent on your own situation, each person's level of consciousness, each person's own free will, all of the things. But very generally speaking, if we're doing this relationship differently, and we come at a crossroads where it feels a little bit more difficult than we thought, does that mean that the relationship needs to end? Or does that mean that we just have to have a different outlook on what we thought was going to be the outcome of this? That's very different. So with Jupiter and Gemini, I get the feeling that it's going to be very hard to create plans long term. Because again, Gemini is about changing our minds. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to constantly change our mind. If there's an eye on the prize per se, it's much more, how do I keep my eye on the prize but remain flexible in the approach? So a really great way to take advantage, especially to take advantage of Jupiter and Gemini, especially with the squares to Saturn, is about how do I break this into chunks and have check-ins with myself about how I feel about it? Because to do it in that way is much more Gemini in nature. So instead of trying to plan out a year ahead, what if I just plan out 12 weeks at a time, right? And 12 weeks at a time actually keeps me really focused. I can plan out 12 weeks. I can say how each day or every week I want to accomplish something. And then once those 12 weeks are over, I can say, what do I want to keep? What do I want to what do I want to change? How do I like this? How does it make me feel? Am I feeling overstimulated? Am I feeling overwhelmed? I'll give you an example. I record a podcast with a friend of mine, and our podcast is called the Blue Butterfly Effect Podcast. One of the things that Ashley and I have learned is that we touch base with each other about every couple of weeks. We touch base like, how are you feeling? Do you want to take a break? Do you want to keep going? So earlier this year, we had said that over the summer, we were going to take a break from recording the podcast. Well, we just spoke last week and we said, you know what? We don't want it to take a break. We don't want to take a break. There's a momentum that we feel about our energy that feels like, no, we should keep going. And we're going to touch base in in September, the end of the summer, and say, do we want to take a break now? Do we want to take a break in the winter? So this is what I'm saying. She's a Gemini, by the way, and we're both Libra ascendants. So the flexibility around how we feel about an overall thing, there's a flexibility there that needs to be had in order for this to not feel overwhelming. Okay. So I hope this is of service to you. I hope this is helpful. Um, I'm keeping this particular Jupiter and Gemini like this, Jupiter and Gemini lesson like this, because there's so much more to say. But if you have questions, if there are things that are coming up for you, put them in the comments. They help me kind of assess where everyone's at, what people know, what people don't know, what people want to hear about. I want to do a little bit more of that. As always, thank you so much for all of your support, your likes, your shares, your subs. If you want a reading or one-on-one coaching, all of my info is down below. You know what to do. Much love to you. I'll talk to you next week.